I have a very clear memory of a piece of wisdom that my father offered to me when I was in elementary school. I was about 11 years old at the time and very small for my age. My small stature combined with my academic ability made me an easy and regular target for bullies. I came home from school one day very upset because one of the big boys had stolen my bag of marbles, a collection I was very proud of. So my dad told me that I had to stand up to them and not let them push me around. When I said that this particular boy was at least a foot taller than I was, he offered me this advice, this wisdom. He said, next time he gives you a problem, you tell him that you would rather be small and smart than big and stupid. I know. Not very good advice. But I was young, and after all, it was my dad that was sharing his wisdom. So I tried it. Needless to say, I didn't fare as well as David did facing Goliath. In fact, I got beat up pretty bad. But a couple of days later, I did get my marbles back. I never used that phrase again, except when I have told this story, and I've told this story many times. But I did eventually gain a deeper wisdom as a result of that encounter. I learned to pay attention to my words, and I learned the importance of facing into the times of uncertainty, facing into times of crisis, rather than running away in fear. I learned the need to be gentle, to be open, to be vulnerable. I learned that I was just as valuable as any other human being, and I had the same right to life. And I learned to see others as valuable and discovered a growing empathy in myself for others that were bullied, marginalized, and devalued. In some ways, I suspect that the wisdom my father offered became a catalyst for my life in ministry in some bizarre turn of fate. Our encounters, our choices, our actions, regardless of their outcome, can lead us to greater wisdom if we are open to learning from our experiences. I have found that each time I am open, each time I am vulnerable, each time I'm willing to risk the uncertainty, my soul is filled with a spirit, and I become one with the God presence that's grounding me in that moment, and holding me despite my fears, holding me in love. This, it seems to me, is the message of the two stories that Gord read for us this morning. The powerful and mighty Philistines are in a position to destroy the Hebrew nation. The Hebrew people are facing a crisis of serious proportion. Goliath becomes symbol of the human condition when driven by fear, where the other, whoever the other might be, is vanquished by brute force, violence, and intimidation. But rather than face that crisis with the same fear, the same violence, this story offers another way. David becomes symbol for the way of love. A small and vulnerable child. In the story, we're told that Saul offers him his armor, but you can imagine the adult armor on this young child just weighed him down. So he takes it off, and he goes into that field with nothing but his tunic. But he also goes filled with the wisdom of the God presence. He says in the story, we need to trust God. And he's willing to face the crisis, trusting in the Spirit to bring life where there is only death. Did David kill Goliath literally? I doubt it. But love killed fear in the field that day. It is in the same way of love that is at the heart of the gospel story as well. The disciples are in danger of drowning. It is a crisis of serious proportion. Their fears of their own Philistine storm come out in their wailing and in their bailing, while Jesus sleeps comfortably on a cushion in the stern of the boat. Jesus becomes a symbol for the way of love, a gentle and peaceful man filled with the wisdom of the God presence, willing to face into the storms of life rather than to run from them, rather than to bail. Did Jesus actually stop nature in his tracks? I doubt it. But love calmed fear on the sea that day. This is why one of the phrases in the Lord's Prayer I have changed from the traditional to another way of looking at it. And it's the line that says, save us from our times of trial. Save us from our times of trouble, from our times of crisis. And I changed that to ground us in our times of trouble. Ground us in our times of trouble. Because I believe it's not that God will save or throw us into crisis. It's that crisis happens, and it's the Spirit of God that will ground us and allow us to live in and through those times. We seem conditioned as human beings to run from crisis when it comes upon us, and to do everything in our power to keep crises from happening, which is impossible to do. Yet it seems to me that crisis can be a great teacher and a great opportunity if we are willing to face it with love, trusting the God presence to be with us through whatever comes. I was going to show a video at this point, which I've decided not to do because we don't need it. Not that it isn't good, and I'll recommend that you go to a link for it, but it's one of the video clips that Bruce Sangwin prepared for BC Conference for the Leading from the Heart theme. And in this video, he talks about crisis as being an opportunity for the birth of something new. And so he compared the crisis that happens in our lives to a supernova that explodes, and it's a catastrophe when this thing explodes, and yet out of that catastrophe comes all of the elements that are necessary for life. And so he's inviting us to lean into crisis, not to love it and look for it, but to lean into it when it's there and recognize that new life can happen in the midst of this time. The question then for me becomes, are we willing to trust the God presence, that deep and sacred wisdom, and allow whatever crisis is before us to open us to the birth of something new? Are we willing to choose love's wisdom as the way to live into and through whatever Philistine storms come? All the critters in Noah's boat in the story this morning experienced a growing fear as crisis mounted. Oh my goodness, how long are we going to be stuck here? What if this is forever? And they only made the crisis worse by the complaining. And it was escalating until Noah finally took a deep breath, called on that spirit of wisdom deep within, and hollered, "We're all in the same boat." That's the way of life, my friends. The armies and the storms will come, and we are being called to let go of our fears, to let go of our need for certainty, and allow the loving presence of the Spirit to lead us through to something new. The late 60s in the United States was a time of massive social and political unrest, a true crisis. The war in Vietnam, the feminist movement, and the African American civil rights protests caused immense uncertainty and unrest. It sparked this true story. It's hard to say what ignited it all in downtown Detroit that summer, but it was mid-July when the trouble began. Within a matter of days, the city was engulfed in what the white community described as a riot and the black community as a rebellion. For both groups, long simmering over years of resentment and suspicion, the kettle finally boiled over. Arson, vandalism, gunfire, fistfights. Detroit was dancing precipitously close to the brink of destruction, and there was little in the way of either wisdom or will to pull her back. Our city was dying, recalls Carl Andreas, a United Auto Workers employee who with his wife and 2 sons lived very near the downtown. Everywhere you looked, you could see fires, burned out hulks of buildings, charred timber where somebody's business or home once stood. It was so very painful. We didn't know what to do, but as a family, we knew we had to do something. We are Mennonites, not only committed to peace, but to the things that make for peace. But like everyone else, we were at loose ends. The Andreas tied up at least one of those loose ends with a single, simple idea that arose during dinner conversation. They made a sign which read, "This house is unarmed." And they placed it in their living room window, visible from the street. If nothing else, the sign at least gave us the opportunity to proclaim our nonviolence. The Andreases observed. It was our own little witness, and if others wished to join us, well, they were welcome to do so. Others did join them, despite protests from some of the neighbors who feared it might attract trouble. A few more signs started appearing sporadically through the neighborhood. And the message spread. We then had a few printed up, Carl remembers, maybe a dozen or so. They had the image of a dove and a home, and of course the words, "This house is unarmed." And we gave them out to our friends, and so the message spread a little more. Some of us made our own, recalled Reverend Nancy Dowdy, new to the city at the time, and the message spread a little more. Eventually, one of the progressive churches in town took up the idea, says Carl, and actually printed quite a few. It may have been hundreds, maybe 1,000. I don't recall exactly how many, but I know it was more than we could have made, and the message spread a little more. An inspired idea became something of a movement, and for the duration of the unrest, all reports indicate that none of the houses that bore signs were touched by the violence. We so often believe that great ideas can only come from great leaders, that effective protest can only be driven by saintly figures. How inspiring to realize that any one of us has the ability to imagine a workable solution and can then turn an idea into a powerful action in a time of crisis. And most amazing of all, it was the Andreas' 11-year-old son, a child, a David, not the power and might of experience, who thought of the sign proclaiming, "This house is unarmed." This child's simple idea became the spark that gave protection and helped restore peace to a violence-torn city. Like Noah, like David, like Jesus, like the Andreases, we are being called to face life crises, whatever they may be and however they may come. We are being called to love, called to an embodied faith, a deep, abiding faith where wisdom brings life.